Starting off this hour, it's one small discussion for world leaders, one huge leap forward when it comes to ending the nuclear standoff between the U.S. and Iran. P5+1 negotiators from the U.S., Iran, Britain, France, Germany, Russia, and China met in Geneva today for the first session in a two-day meeting. The goal is to come up with framework to deal with Iran's nuclear program and to limit the country's ability to create weapons. This meeting is monumental in importance, not only because of the nuclear implications, but also because of the warming relations between D.C. and Tehran, with the country's new leader, Hassan Rouhani. To talk more in depth about all of this, I'm joined now by Brian Becker. He's the national coordinator at the Answer Coalition. Thank you so much for joining me. First of all, let's start off with the likelihood that anything will actually come from these negotiations. What do you think it is?
Well, the United States has severe economic sanctions on Iran. Iran's banking system is basically frozen out of the international economic situation. It can't sell its oil, and Iranian assets are frozen all over the world. The United States may want to have some progress with the talks, but ultimately the United States isn't really worried about Iran's nuclear weapons. Iran doesn't possess nuclear weapons. The U.S. doesn't say it does possess nuclear weapons. Iran is a member of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, say unlike Israel, for instance, which does not allow inspectors. What the U.S. really wants is to overthrow the government in Iran. It's a long-term proposition. The sanctions are designed to destabilize Iran, and they're thinking, the U.S. is thinking right now with the new elections that perhaps there's some vulnerability inside the Iranian government that they can exploit. I think that's their real strategy.
So one of the things that we have to address here is obviously the Obama administration is opening itself up to these kinds of talks. However, is that what Congress wants, considering the fact that before President Obama even discussed the idea of meeting with Iranian officials, Congress had put on the table another round of possible sanctions?
Oh, right. I mean, the Congress is devoted to endless war, not only in the Middle East, but all around the world. I mean, it's really dominated by the most hawk-like figures, the most militarized forces or pro-militarist forces. So now we have Congress glibly trying to put new economic sanctions, even harsher economic sanctions, which have already caused a lot of economic suffering for the Iranian people. Obama's got that right-wing pressure on him. But overall, I would say that while there's a right-wing pressure in Congress, Obama and the right wing have, as I said, a general strategic agreement that the real goal is not to stop a so-called nuclear weapons program in Iran, but to carry out ultimately the destabilization of Iran and regime change.
Now, one of the really interesting kind of things of all of this is obviously the U.S. has very close ties with both Saudi Arabia and Israel, which both have a very vested interest in how these P5+1 negotiations go. Do we have any idea at this point how they are responding to these warming tensions?
Well, you can see in the orientation by the Netanyahu government in Israel, for instance, that they are totally opposed to any sort of peaceful outcome, any sort of negotiated settlement. Why is that? Because Israel really benefits from complete tension in the Middle East. It says to the United States, here you have a reliable ally, a partner, really a proxy in the Middle East, in this troubled region where two-thirds of the world's oil is. And with constant tension and war, Israel proves to the United States why it should get $4 billion every year in taxpayers' money. So Israel is opposed to the negotiations. The Saudis have also an existential opposition to the Iranian government because they know that what happened in Iran in 1979 when the people rose up and overthrew the king, that could happen in Saudi Arabia too. That's why the Saudis are really afraid of Iran, because they know that there could be revolutions that spread throughout the entire region.
And the U.S. isn't only dealing with pressures from Saudi Arabia and Israel from outside the country, they're also dealing with these pressures from inside. In a recent USA Today article, AIPAC President Michael Kassan said, AIPAC continues to support congressional action to adopt legislation to further strengthen sanctions, and there will absolutely be no pause, delay, or moratorium in our efforts. So can you talk about the influence of a lobbying group like AIPAC on decisions that are made in these negotiations and in the future?
Well, I think AIPAC is a strong lobby. We know that. But, you know, I think their influence is somewhat exaggerated. You could see AIPAC was demanding war against Syria, but once the American people were engaged, once the American people made it clear that there was across-the-board opposition to a new war against Syria, the influence of AIPAC, supposedly so grand, actually started to be seen in its real perspective. The United States government isn't taking its cues in terms of strategy in this strategically and resource-rich part of the world from AIPAC, even though, yes, they dole out millions of dollars every year to Congress. Ultimately, the U.S. makes its decisions based on its geostrategic interests as an empire in the area of the world that has 2/3 of the world's oil.
And how this all plays out in the future and how these tensions actually ease and relations really build between these two countries. We're on a new front. We're going to have to see how it all happens with Hassan Rouhani at the reins, really. But what we do have is Israel calling him a wolf in sheep's clothing. Brian Becker, National Coordinator at the Answer Coalition, thank you so much.
Thanks.